I want to play a clip of you when you were on Fox News talking about reparations. And you were on there with Kimberly, what's her name? Kimberly Klacik, who ran for ran for rep in Baltimore and bombed ridiculously. We invited her on the show. She never came on. But I want to play a clip of her response to you just laying down facts. Here's what she's a black Republican, and here's what she says about reparations. Keep my mic on.
You had 28% of Black Americans in those states that actually owned Black people as well. They were slave owners. Then you had the Cherokee Indians and other Indian tribes that also owned Black people. And so when you look at the numbers today, you only find 5% of white people that are generationally connected to slavery. So are you asking that 5% to take on that burden? And then secondly, you have to prove the fact that slavery is the reason that some Black people are struggling today and others are not. Like Richard and myself, we don't live below the poverty line. But back in the 1940s, you had 80% of Black people living below the poverty line. By you got to the 1960s, you only had 47% living below the poverty line, and we were able to make that jump without reparations. So you have to really look at what's going on here, because in 1965, when they introduced the welfare state, I think that's what is to blame for the problem that we see today. When you ask the Black woman to marry...
Stop. This is the reason why people don't trust media. I couldn't believe when I heard this. Kimberly Klacik, I could not believe when I heard her say this. One, the welfare state begins in the 1930s. I thought everybody knew that. That's FDR. That's the New Deal. She literally put out a date that is 30 years off. Two, before FDR and the New Deal, the overwhelming majority of Americans were poor. They were poor. So yes, 80% of Black folks were below the poverty line. So was everybody else. And the reason why that it changed, I don't know if her number is right as far as the 47. The reason why that changes is because of FDR's New Deal, is because of social programs, is because of quote unquote welfare. They didn't call it welfare back then. That's why many Black folks were able to get above the poverty line, just above it, because of these social programs that she is attacking and attaching Black folks to it in the 1960s. And then even worse, the majority of folks on welfare are white. Welfare is not a Black issue. Even per capita, the majority of folks on welfare are white. And when I hear someone like her, when you were talking, you're putting out facts and numbers and stats, and she literally is making up things and upholding white supremacy on live television, not even trying to use facts, not even trying to use accurate numbers. And one more thing, that 5% number, I looked for that everywhere and I couldn't find it anywhere. I'm like, is that true? 5% of white folks have a connection to slavery? And I'm thinking of Aetna. I'm thinking of corporations. I'm thinking of Quaker Oats. I'm thinking of every major corporation in this country has a connection to slavery. I'm like, let me just see if that's right. I couldn't find it anywhere. So this is what I'm talking about. You're literally on camera spitting out incorrect information, dates, numbers, stats, and then racializing welfare, when welfare is really a white issue. And then she admits that she's not even, associated with poverty. She didn't, whatever experience she had. So you have your own classism in there as well. And I said, this is the reason why folks don't trust Black Republicans. That didn't make any sense. It was illogical, Richard. It didn't make any sense.
I will give you that.
Begins with FDR. How is she on TV and not knowing that?
What I will say there is this. In the television segment, as you know, Clay, you literally have 4 minutes, sometimes 5 minutes. And so you have an obligation, and my obligation is to the audience to talk about facts. And you can't get mired down in sort of going back through and trying to go point by point and deconstruct
I'm not
all
saying
of
you,
her lives.
Richard. I'm not saying you, Richard. I'm not saying you should have done that. That wasn't your job. Because it was too much.
There was too much, because the only fact, if I had more time, the one fact that I would want to deconstruct is the fact around Black people owning slaves, because that was the most heartbreaking one there.
Oh my God.
Because the reason why that's so heartbreaking is when you look into the analogs of history, right? And you have to look now, yes, there were a very small majority of Black folks Very small. There's a very small majority of Black folks that own slaves for the purpose of enslavement and for slave labor. But a majority of the Black folks that own slaves were because they bought their family members. And just think
Exactly.
about that for a minute. And that's what I said, like, you to use that language is almost taking the humanity out of your own life, right? And that is what hurt me when she said that, because I'm like, look, think about that, because I think about my own ancestors. Because even though I'm from Jamaica, I'm still from an enslaved culture, right? And I think about that, thinking about my great 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 grandfather having to go buy his daughter and having to go buy his son because they're being enslaved by somebody else. And so he's a free person, and he has to go save up every nickel and every dime that he has so he can go free his child. That is a painful thing. And you're doing that understanding that at any point in time, after you've bought their freedom, they can go back into enslavement, as a story you told at the beginning of this hour. A woman that was free went back, and it goes back even to Frederick Douglass's autobiography, where when he walks the streets of New York and he meets somebody that he saw and who he was enslaved with, and the person said, "Don't trust anybody, because,
even in New York."
Even in New York, because at any time you could go back into
the
institution and be recaptured. And so the fact that you would get on television and say Black people own slaves and that's some justification, and not explain, well, the reason why Black folks 9 times out of 10, actually 9.99%, 9 times out of 10 own slaves, is because they bought their family. Think about the humanity in that. And I'm like, girl, you don't even understand. Like, you are just spitting out facts, and you're spitting out facts, and you don't even understand the law, because
not facts. You're spitting out misinformation.
Misinformation, right?
Yeah,
exactly. Spitting
propaganda.
out misinformation, and you don't even understand the law, because Sheila Jackson Lee's bill doesn't even cut a check. All Sheila Jackson Lee's bill says is, can we study it? Can we look at the facts? Can we look and say, because of slavery, Wells Fargo is one of the biggest banks in the world, right? Can we look at it and say, because of slavery, all of these companies, major companies, like you said, Aetna, Georgetown University,
right?
Georgetown University exists today because they sold their slaves. Can we have these type of conversations? And because we're unwilling as a nation to have these conversations, because everybody wants to worry about who's going to pay for it, how we pay for it. And I said in the segment at the back end of it, I said, look, the solution is pretty simple, because General Sherman had a Field Order 15, which basically said from the islands of right around Charleston,
this is during Reconstruction, y'all.
Yeah, and Field Order 15, right after the Civil War, there was a field order was issued. And it basically said from right around Charleston to the St. Johns River, which is modern day Jacksonville, which was all land that was confiscated by the Union. They said from this point to this point, all this land will be given to slaves in parcels of 40 acres. And this land will be given to those that were enslaved so they can begin to live their life as free people, right?
And then it was taken away from them. Was
actually given to people, and then 1 year later, so we're gonna take that back. And so
because of Andrew Johnson, Demon Andrew Johnson.
So if we just value that land, if we just do this, if we just value the land from Charleston, South Carolina, to the St. Johns River, and we say, what is the value of that land in modern day American dollars, and say, okay, based on this, that's how much the reparation check should be. I think the enslaved people from enslaved descendants should just say that right there. That's the baseline. That's the baseline number.
But like you said, Richard, it's simply a conversation, and then this black woman is being propped up, saying things that are completely illogical, do not make any sense, wildly wrong, and it's just. And someone like her, that's one of the ingredients of white supremacy, to have a person in a black body defending the most insidious parts of our history. I mean, it's Black people own slaves. And mind you, the small number, the tiny, tiny number, there's barely any documentation of it, of Black folks who did own slaves. And I learned this when I was in college. This was like African-American History 101. The way the enslaved people were treated, for the ones that did own slaves that weren't part of their family, they were treated much differently, because at that point, it isn't race-based slavery, right? At that point, the power dynamic changes because slavery existed all over the world. But what Europeans did, they did a race-based slavery. White folks enslaved white folks. But it was specifically based on race, based on region, based on breaking apart families, based on language, religion, the whole bit. So to hear her say that was so disgusting. Shame on you. Shame on you, Kimberly Klacik. That was at the bottom of the barrel. That was the bottom of the barrel. It was an insult to history, an insult to American history, an insult to Black history. Just disgusting.